Key Strategies for Fortune 500 Companies. Please welcome to the stage the moderator of this session, the Hispanic Association on Corporate Responsibility's Executive Vice President and Chief Operating Officer, Sylvia Perez Cash.
Hola, buenos dias, mi gente. How are you? Okay, a couple people need to trickling back in. Text your colleagues. They don't miss out. They're starting. I don't know about you, but that music, I was in the back and I was doing my little bit of salsa in the back. It's like, oh, this is definitely the vibe that I need today. So are we enjoying ourselves this morning? Thank you. Good. I'm glad to hear it. It was an incredible morning. You know, Sid, our first session, thank you, Sid, really hit on an important topic that's core to Sarah's message, our advocacy about the power of Latinx inclusion. And it's accessing the corporate board leadership role and, frankly, the strategic pathway to that end goal. So it was an incredible session, and I hope you took that all in. And then to have that followed by our look in the boardroom session gave us some of the fascinating insights, really rare to have the opportunity to listen to explore in conversation between a CEO and their corporate board director. Thank you to Jack in the Box for sharing that rare perspective with us. We know from our research that our country has a very long way to go around Hispanic representation on Fortune 500 boards. We know that that current level of representation doesn't come anywhere close to the percentage of Hispanics that are in the general population in this country. We heard that referenced in the conversation with Jack in the Box. We also heard a reference to our collaborative research, the Alliance for Board Diversity, which I'll share is releasing its most recent report this coming Thursday. We do this in partnership with Deloitte. It's a powerful report. I'm forbidden to share details, sworn to secrecy, right? But on Thursday, I would say, please go to our website, download this copy of the report, and use it as you're reading for your flight home. And I will tell you, be prepared. Not much has changed around Latinx inclusion on corporate boards in the last 5 years. Again, I won't give you the real stats, but be prepared. Since 2008, the percentage of Fortune 500 seats held by Latinx individuals has hovered between 4 and 5%. Since 2008. In 2020, only 1% of Fortune 500 seats were held by Latinas specifically. You know, you'll read the numbers. I don't want it to be the bearer of bad news, because the report will also share lots of positive trends that are happening around the diversification of corporate boards. These are trends that we want to amplify. These are trends that we want to encourage to see in governance models, but they're also trends that we want to see applied to us and to our community and to you. What I am trying to do is to share why each of you here today is important. The insights and the networks that you're investing in while you're spending your time with us in developing yourself, developing your social capital, developing the perspective that will distinguish you in corporate America, this is what will position you for your future corporate board leadership. In other words, take more notes as the day goes on. We are grateful for the opportunity to bring you here together today for this program. We want to make sure that you're letting all your corporate board peers and colleagues know that you're here. Please share about this opportunity with your mentees, with your colleagues, with your boards that you may sit on. And if you're on social media, do us a favor and share there too. You can tag us at HaserEP23 and help people follow the story. This is really important. Now, to the juice. It is my pleasure to introduce our next session, Navigating Through Crisis, Key Strategies for Fortune 500 Companies. Risk management, frankly, may not be the first thing that comes to mind when you're thinking about strategies to advance your executive careers. But I promise you, by the end of this session, you'll think about it a little bit differently. Joining us today is the partner and co-chair of Morrison Foester's Global Risk and Management Crisis Group. He draws from his experience in the leadership of the National Security Division of the U.S. Department of Justice to advise clients on national security and cybersecurity. In 2022, the Daily Journal named him a top cyber lawyer and featured him in its top 40 under 40 list. Please help me in welcoming to the stage our esteemed guest, Mr. Alex Iftami.
Thank you.
Hi, Alex. Welcome again. Thank you for joining us today.
Thank you very much for having me. It's great to be with you and with this great group of executives.
Yes, we are looking forward to this conversation. So the word crisis, I think it's fair to say in fairly absolute terms, it's never a welcome word at work, right? You would agree?
I would agree.
Right, but as with every challenge, if leveraged correctly, it could offer a very unique opportunity and learning lesson. Would you also agree with that?
I would absolutely agree with that as well.
All right, well, let's dive in. So first, we're going to level set to make sure we're all talking about the same thing here and using some common language. How would you describe the fundamental principles of crisis management?
Well, the way I think about crisis management is about the process that organizations use to be able to make decisions in the face of crisis. It's about being able to marshal information to bring the right stakeholders to the table for an organization to be able to make the best decisions possible under time pressure, often in difficult circumstances where the reputation of an organization, where the reputation of executives of the company and leaders within companies are on the line.
All right, so when you think about that, and we're going to touch on all of those points from the perspective of leadership, what are some of the looming crises that companies are preparing for, thinking of, worried about today?
You know, the type of crises that might face an organization are all over the map. It's really hard to be able to say what the crisis is that an organization is going to face tomorrow, because the reality is what makes a crisis is the unexpected nature of what's about to come. And when organizations think about what are the crises they need to be prepared for, they're often thinking about a wide variety of things. They might be thinking about environmental or natural disasters. They will be thinking about workplace violence. What if someone brings a gun to the office or there's an event? They may be thinking about a environmental hazard, whether it's a spill of toxic materials or something like that. They might be thinking about a cybersecurity incident. What if our organization is hit with a ransomware attack? And they might also be thinking about what if there are allegations against a company employee or a company executive of sexual harassment or similar events. And so it really is all over the map. And I'll give you one other example that was entirely unexpected, I think, to every organization who had to deal with it. But even something like the Silicon Valley Bank collapse earlier this year, and what do organizations who had their bank accounts at Silicon Valley Bank do in order to make sure they're resilient in the face of a situation like that? And the reality is, the response to each of those situations is going to vary widely in terms of the substance of what an organization is going to do. So
that was a very diverse list of topics and really complicated and frankly, to some intimidating set of subjects. And so I would say if anyone was listening to that list as I was and thinking, whoa, what would I do if my CEO were to call me in tomorrow and ask me to help deal with one of these crises? If you ask yourself that question, I want you to hold on to that question and pause. We're going to ask it again at the end, all right? So I mentioned that this crisis, as big and looming as they can be, are also areas of opportunity, correct? So how would you say that leading during a crisis is an opportunity?
Well,
Why should executives lean in?
The old adage about crisis management is never let a good crisis go to waste. And the thinking behind that, it makes a whole lot of sense, which is crises are a moment for an organization to really focus on an issue, where you have the attention of leaders across an organization who are focused on not just the hypothetical consequences of what might happen to the organization, but who are facing a very real threat to the company. And so crises are an opportunity in part for an organization because they are an opportunity to improve processes, to devote resources to an issue that really merits the attention and improvements in process or how a company handles a particular situation. And there are very rare moments when an organization is singularly focused on an issue and can drive change that will benefit the organization for years, decades to come. And so one of the ways to think about crisis is we're going to have to get through the crisis of today, but it's also how do we make sure that we put the organization on solid footing so that we don't have a recurrence of this issue in the future. And so it's an opportunity for the organization, and it is also an opportunity for individuals to really contribute in a time of need for the organization and to add value to what is going to be a fast-moving, dynamic process that requires response.
Exactly, but it's not a situation that we have a lot of opportunity to practice. Hopefully not, right? And so when we talk about learning how to manage, if you are that executive tapped to contribute in this really unique moment of both challenge and opportunity for your company, you want to know what to do. So how would you describe some of the key successes, the characteristics of success from a management perspective when you're dealing with a crisis?
It's a great question, and I think a lot of people think about crisis management as, who is the person at the top of the organization that's got to make the difficult decisions. But I actually think crisis management is really about the process that gets to that final decision that is made by an organization. And the most important contributors in an organization facing a crisis are the people who are able to marshal information from the organization, who are able to bring together the right stakeholders for the organization to make informed decisions, who can tee up and frame the key issues that an organization needs to be thinking about for a CEO and senior leadership to make decisions. Those are the characteristics that really define an effective crisis response. And so as I think about the individuals that I have seen really shine across crises that I've helped organizations handle, it's the individuals who are collaborators, who listen as much as they speak, who are able to pull together the information from across an organization to distill it into what the key information is that is required to be able to make decisions and to be able to put together a process for making sure that information gets to the decision makers and allows them to make the best decisions possible in a fast-moving situation. And so the stars of crisis response are the people who can help an organization develop the process for how decisions are made, how information is communicated up the chain in an accurate fashion. And I'm, my perspective on this is also influenced by where I was trained and where I grew up thinking about crises, and that's through the National Security Council process of the executive branch. As you'd mentioned in my introduction, my role at the Department of Justice working on national security issues, part of my work at the Department of Justice was being part of the executive branch's decision-making process in the context of national security events, national security threats, and the process that the National Security Council established to make sure all of the relevant agencies had a seat at the table, had a process for contributing information, that information worked its way up from policy council meetings with subject matter experts to deputies who would distill the key issues to principals who would ultimately make the ultimate decisions about what the national security policy of the United States should be. And the way in which organizations, particularly large organizations like the Fortune 100, Fortune 500 companies that are represented here, should be adopting and should be thinking about is similarly, how do we make sure we bring information together, we get the right people in a room to be able to discuss the pressing crisis of the day to make the best decision possible for the organization.
So I'm going to dive into that just a little bit for a little more granularity. When it comes to building that collaborative processes and identifying the voices that need to inform the ultimate decision makers, how would you advise an executive to go about selecting those teams of people within their company? You know, I'm assuming we don't have the government here. There's a lot of structure embedded in that that's kind of pre-existing. Companies have very, very different structures, right?
Yep.
So they're not all the same. So how would you go about that process, that step in this really critical process building?
Taking just a step back from that, and I will answer the question, it is about a diversity of views, and I think that's an important theme for this group in particular. When crisis management goes wrong, it is often because the decision makers are working in a silo. They're only getting some of the perspective of how an event or a crisis is influencing the organization. And the diversity of perspective, whether it's a diversity of people across the organizations from different functions, frankly, even just different life perspectives on how a crisis impacts an organization, are critically important in how an organization responds to crisis. But picking up your specific question too, it's about making sure that when you bring together a crisis management team, that stakeholders are represented from different parts of the organization that need to be there. You want to make sure that you have your communications teams who can advise on what public messaging should look like for the organization. Your customer success teams who will have a perspective on how will your customers hear the information about the company's crisis? What will they want to hear? How do you communicate with those customers? You want to make sure you have legal at the table who can help inform what are our regulatory, what are the regulatory legal implications of the event we're dealing with. You'll want to have HR and finance because their respective functions are important in understanding the implications on the workforce of an organization and on the finances of an organization. And you also ideally want to build within your organizations a team of folks who are responsible for crisis management as a discipline, who are the keepers of an organization's crisis management plan, who having a sense of who the crisis management lead for an organization is, who is it that convenes these meetings and sets the agenda. All of those aspects are important in kind of defining the role and the process that an organization responds to crises through.
Thank you. So there's one group that I was listening for, and we kind of discussed earlier. What about the board? Right? We've talked a lot about our boards, these corporate boards and our directors. When do you engage the board in a crisis? When does that point person, the lead of the team, make that call or advise that action?
It's a good question, and I know this picks up on some of the discussion that you all have been having this morning. it's important to make sure that that's not a question you're answering in the middle of a crisis. Who to contact on the board, how to contact them, what are the circumstances under which the board would want to be notified about a crisis. Those are things that you really want to be thinking about ahead of time. And so ideally, this is something where an organization, your organizations, should have a crisis management plan that lays out some of the things we've talked about, right? Who are the key stakeholders who should be at the table for making decisions? Frankly, not only who are the key stakeholders, but who are their delegates, their deputies who should be in the room if the person that would typically be there isn't available, because invariably crises will strike at the wrong time on a holiday weekend when your executives are on a plane to Europe for some conference. And so you've got to think through the contingencies. And one of those contingencies really is when should you engage with the board about a crisis? And I think a lesson I have learned, and some of my clients have learned the hard way in some cases, is boards don't like to be surprised, right? They don't want to hear about an issue that affects the reputation of an organization from the news. They want to hear it from the company. And so you do want to have a process for making sure you are engaging with the board and letting them know what is going on. And ideally, you would have that conversation with the board of directors before a crisis strikes and really work through the factors and the criteria of when would they want to be notified about a crisis and who should be notified. Is it the audit committee? Is it the chair of the audit committee? Is it the full board? Is it the board chair? Who gets that phone call, and what is the process for communicating information to the board, understanding that some of this information may be preliminary, that you may not have time to convene a full board meeting because the definition of a crisis is something that is fast moving, but to make sure you have an understanding with your board so everybody's on the same page. And then the other observation I would just make about the board of directors is, the reality is the board of directors in the midst of a crisis shouldn't be directing the company's response. The role of a board of directors is they will play the biggest role ahead of time in helping a company define what its processes are and what the expectations should be about how a company responds to a crisis. And then their role is also really important after a crisis in helping to assess what went wrong and to keep the company accountable for how it's going to improve in the future. During a crisis, a board should be informed, consulted. They will have perspectives, valuable perspectives for an organization, but both to protect the company, to protect the board against lawsuits against them. They really shouldn't be the ones managing a crisis, because it really requires real-time response that the board is not going to be particularly well situated to do.
Thank you. I think that's really insightful and key. And if you think about the aspect, if you're evaluating your company's risk management plan, understanding the role that the board plays versus management is a really important distinction. So thank you for bringing that up. We've talked a little bits and pieces about this preventative components of this process. There are things that you can do in advance. Mapping out this communication tree structure, if I could call it that per se, understanding who owns your risk management discipline in the company and knowing who that person is, thinking about their crisis management tools. But as you also said, that the leaders of these plans aren't leading alone, both internally, but perhaps also externally. So could you talk about how we should be using advisors to complement the leadership that's needed in these times of crises?
Absolutely, and I'll speak to advisors, and then I think some of the other things that maybe an organization should be thinking about ahead of time, the things that should be in an organization's plan. The point about advisors is an important one, because although the crisis an organization is dealing with may be new to that organization, it's almost certainly not the first organization dealing with that issue. And it is so important to be able to make sure that the decisions that an organization makes are informed by experts who have been through those issues before, who can help an organization see around corners, who can think a step ahead of what will tomorrow bring, what will a week from now bring, what are the decisions that you need to make today, what are the things that you can leave off until tomorrow because you will be pressed for resources and for time. And the advisors that any organization should be thinking about are crisis communications firms who can really help an organization think about how to structure the messaging around a crisis that you're dealing with. Thinking about if an organization is dealing with a crisis that will get the attention of regulators or law enforcement, making sure that an organization brings on the right experts who have experience in front of those regulators, who will understand the questions that will be posed by those regulators of the company when it comes time to account for how the company responded to the incident. And that can be consultants, it can be law firms, and it will vary by incident. My work, the crises that I most frequently help organizations with are cyber incidents, everything from ransomware attacks to incidents perpetrated by nation-state actors. And we always work, and our clients always work in those circumstances with forensic firms who really are expert in understanding what happened, sometimes in the context of ransomware incidents, with advisors who have expertise in negotiating with these threat actors and being able to string along the conversation, who have spoken to these threat actors in the past. That kind of expertise is important to bring to an organization, and depending on the type of crisis, there will be different types of experts that you want to bring on board.
So let's talk about a little bit. You mentioned post-crisis in the context of the board. I want to bring it down to the management level as the executives are working on this challenge together. Why is post-crisis leadership equally important as in-crisis leadership?
It's a great question. It's important because that's where the learning happens. That's where an organization improves its processes. Certainly it helps to exercise the muscle of going through a crisis, and that builds its own institutional memory and capacity for an organization. But part of what every organization should do when it deals with a crisis is to take stock after the fact of what went well, and that's really important, right? What went well? What did we do well? And also what didn't go so well, and where are the areas where we can improve, where we can build better processes? Was information escalated to executive management in a timely manner? Was the information that was escalated to executive management accurate? Did we have the right sources of information that were brought to bear as part of this crisis management process to make sure we were giving executives accurate information about what was happening off the ground? Did we have good methods of communicating? One of the things that often comes up in a crisis is if you're dealing with a natural disaster or you're dealing with a cyber attack, it may take offline your primary means of communicating. Your email systems may go down. Your online directory with phone numbers might go down. What are your processes of communicating among the people who are part of the crisis management response for out-of-band communications? Do you have a flashcard in your wallet with the key people's phone numbers and information? Do you have Signal accounts or other accounts to be able to message securely in the event of a crisis? Those are things to think about, and sometimes are things that you have to think about after a crisis when it didn't go so well. And the other, just one other point to cover is who is the decision maker for important decisions that an organization will make in a crisis? There is a tendency in the best of organizations to mimic what happens at a 5-year-old soccer game, which is to say, if you've ever seen 4, 5, 6-year-olds play soccer, everybody runs to the ball, and that is what happens in crises in large organizations also, because people are well-intentioned, they want to help, but not everybody needs to run to the ball to the same place at the same time. It's important to make sure that there are clear roles and responsibilities that are assigned in an organization, and to think about who's responsible for taking action, who needs to approve an action, who needs to be consulted, who needs to be informed about decisions. Having a what is called a RACI chart is really important, and to build into that chart key decisions. Who's authorized to communicate with the public or the media about a crisis? Who is authorized to take systems offline or to shut down a plant or to close down a facility? Who makes those decisions, and making sure that that's laid out in a decision-making structure?
And I think that as I hear you talk and we're going through these, it makes sense. You would think everybody should just follow these steps, but we know that they don't, right? And so could you kind of share with us, when a management approach doesn't succeed, what are the most common mistakes?
It's a hard question to answer because it's hard to identify patterns. Each crisis is often unique, but I think it hits on some of the things we were just talking about that are some of the things organizations end up fixing after the fact. Things go wrong when you don't have the right stakeholders in the room, when decisions get made without ensuring that the decision makers are fully informed about the consequences and have thought through all of the different angles. What happens if I take a plant offline, or what happens if certain other important decisions are made? Another point of failure is communicating as an organization without having all of the facts, or prematurely before all of the facts have been developed. And this comes up with unfortunate frequency, where organizations will make a statement that they then have to walk back a day, 2 days, 3 days later. And there is this visceral desire to be able to communicate, to explain to employees, to customers, to the public, this is what happened. But it's also important to recognize that on day one of a crisis, you may not have all of the facts about what happened, what the culpability of the organization was, the involvement of particular employees. And so the rush to conclusion is something that gets organizations into trouble. It is fine in almost all cases to say, we're looking into it. We've got a process. We are investigating what happened. We are taking a rigorous look, and we will update you when we have more information to share about that. Certainly, there are holding statements. There are things you will need to say to provide some comfort, but avoiding the rush to kind of communicate with finality about what has occurred is one key takeaway that, as I think about it, is a theme among many of the crisis responses I've seen.
And so we've talked, the importance of the post-crisis reflection and evaluative process, really this organizational reflection. But I want to bring it to the individual. So do you find that within that process, part of the organization's reflection is to evaluate the leadership, individual leadership? And if not, how would one do that on their own? How would you make sure that you learn as a leader, as executive, from this really unique experience?
I think my first observation would be, it really is important to take some time and reflect. there's always a lot going on in large organizations, and there's a tendency to run from one crisis to the next. But taking time to really do a post-mortem and think about the things that could have gone better, and thinking about both at a personal level how you could have contributed to those things going better, and also at an organizational level, what are the processes and procedures that you can help implement to make sure that things go better in the future are important. But going back to what is, I think, a really important theme for me of process, it's really thinking about, did we structure meetings the right way? Were the meetings we had as crisp and as effective in reaching important decisions as they could have been? I think it is helpful to be to want to seek perfection in these contexts, and to think even just at the level of, like, when we organize the agendas for crisis management meetings, are they organized the right way? Do we start with people presenting new information? What are the facts we're operating on to make sure that everybody has level set it? Do we have a structure for making sure that we're not just jumping all over the place and making decisions, but that we work through customer issues, employee issues, communication issues with the public, legal issues, to have an organized process to think about the decisions that need to be made as an organization. Those are the things as I reflect on what can I do better when I help clients deal with crisis that I'm often caught up on, of, like, how can I improve the process that allows my clients to get to a better decision.
Thank you. So we opened up this idea of this conversation with the idea, what if you're tapped on the shoulder? But I kind of want to explore the possibility that you're not tapped, right? That you aren't a part of the plan, that you weren't thought of as having a role in either as an informer and an analyst, the one who synthesizes, or the decision maker, using my own terminology there. But you want to be, right? You want to be a part of this process. You want to have the opportunity to contribute and to demonstrate your leadership in these spaces. What would your advice be to an executive who wants to create a space for themselves when this crisis arises?
It's a great question, and it's one where I think it's important to strike the right balance between what's good for you, the individual, and what's good for the organization, right? It harkens back to the example of everybody running to the ball. Forcing your way into the crisis management process in a crisis is, in all likelihood, not the right approach to take to having a seat at the table. I think it starts with expressing interest and showing that you have the right experience, the right temperament, the right judgment to earn a seat at that table. And I've always been a believer in show, don't tell, right? And so it starts with showing your leadership that you have that ability rather than telling them you do. And so I think it starts with making sure that when crisis hits, figuring out what is the way in which that crisis affects your part of the world, your area of responsibility, and making sure that you've really locked that part down, that you are providing crisp summaries of what's going on in your portion of the organization or your area of responsibility, communicating that to the right stakeholders, responding quickly when requests are made of you and your organization, and having that part really solid. And once you have that, then you build on that, right? And you have a conversation with your executive team, your manager, about other ways you can contribute, the fact that you would like to be more involved next time in a broader area of the response to a crisis. And I think that that iterative process really builds on itself.
I think that's really important to hear, because it's not every day you go to a leadership advancement convening and they say, don't jump in to solve this problem, right? That the time for you to demonstrate your leadership is before. That, and to think about who else is really asking questions about the risk management plan in your department. It could be you. If you think, I know we're no strangers here to the value of strategic planning in your own careers, making sure we want to get you to that corporate board level. And that doesn't happen on its own, right? We'll do this with a collective effort, but it's also an intentional effort. You want that, and you position yourself for that. And the same thing goes for these type of really important, unique leadership experiences, is dealing with the crisis. If you know that you want to be in the plan and you're not currently, to work on that now, before the crises arise.
And I would just build on that. I think that's a great point, is to think before a crisis strikes about building resiliency plans and contingency plans for your portion of the organization, because that's really the skill set that is important to crisis management, that shines in a crisis, and that you can demonstrate ahead of time if this is something you're really interested in and want to be a part of, is demonstrating that interest in thinking about how does our organization run if something goes, something specific goes wrong? What is the contingency plan? How do we make sure we're resilient in the face of a natural disaster, a cyber attack, whatever the most likely risks and threats to your portion of the organization might be?
So we are going to open up to Q&A in a moment, in about a minute. So start to think about your questions, jot them down. We really want you to have the opportunity to share them with the group. But before we do, I'm going to take it back to that original question that I asked you to hold on to. If you're tapped and your first response would have been at the beginning of this session to say, I don't know if I really want to be a part of that crisis. That seems like a major liability to my career, right? What would you hope that every person in this room would say now if their CEO tapped them tomorrow?
Well, my answer to it would be, if the chair of our law firm came to me and said, what's the first thing we need to think about in the face of X crisis? It's what is the process for getting you accurate, fast information to allow you to make the best decisions possible for the organization? Thank you.
So we are going to open it up to Q&A, and I'm looking for my colleagues. Oh, I see some hands here who have the mic. Wanda, we have right here in the front.
Good afternoon. My name is Jessica Robledo Garcia, the North America Supply and Demand Senior Director for Procter & Gamble. And you closed out on what I have a question about. So what are some of the best practices that you've seen or you would advise for ensuring the best accuracy of data?
Great question. Great question.
It is. It's making sure that information is coming from the source. The problem that organizations face, particularly large organizations, is there's a game of telephone that happens. And every time you've got a different link in that chain of telephone, information gets altered just a little bit. And so when you get to that executive team that is acting on that information, sometimes that information is no longer what it should be. And so partly it's making sure that the people who are perhaps one level down from those executive decision makers, that they're really working to get that information from its source, right? What are the people who are looking at the crisis, whether it's an environmental, hazardous spill in an office, or the people who are investigating a cyber attack, that you're getting the information about what they know from the source, rather than from people who have an idea of what might be going on, but it might be a little bit garbled.
We had a question in the middle right here, Wanda. Oh, sorry, over there.
Hi,
Yes.
my name is Chris Pajaro. My question is a little aligned with what you commented before. It's more about your career path, actually. So how and why did you land in crisis management? And also, I assume this is a component under legal affairs, based on your background. And if that's a right assumption, if this is a required qualification to be leading crisis management in that level?
All good questions, and let me start with the last question, which is to say, I don't think being a lawyer is by any stretch required to be an effective crisis manager. If anything, it's a liability because lawyers talk too much. They are mired in in legal questions and perhaps sometimes take too long to make decisions in the face of a crisis. So that's certainly not the only skill set that's important. And I do think my career trajectory influences how I got to crisis management, because it came from dealing with crises and with fast-paced situations when I was in government, where I was a lawyer. I worked at the Department of Justice, but worked more so on policy issues rather than legal issues. Everything from dealing with hostage situations to state-sponsored economic espionage and cyber attacks, and dealing with fast-paced situations. And I think that is the experience that has allowed me to do the type of work that I do now. And the experiences that I think are important are seeing processes that have been run well. And for me, that was seeing the National Security Council, but certainly that's not the only place where these types of decisions are made in crisis situations. And the other experience is just going through enough of these where they're not hair on fire situations anymore, but where you can take a step back, think about the broader picture, recognize that the organization is going to be just fine. It's a matter of getting through it. It's a matter of not rushing to judgment or to decisions, making sure you've got the right information and the right people in the room, and following, having faith in the process that you've established for getting to, getting beyond the crisis of the day. And so I think a lot of experiences lend themselves really, really well to that.
So I was going to say, we have this one. He was one of the first hands, and there was one in the front here that was one of the first hands. I just want to make sure we get to them. I forget someone up here.
Hi, Esteban Morales from Google. So I think by definition, you can't plan for a crisis, right? It's something that's unexpected that you may not be able to foresee. So therefore, you're not going to have a process or a plan ahead of time. So you probably have to default back to principles around communication, information gathering, decision making. Could you outline, what are some principles that you'd want to adhere to during a crisis, and maybe differ those from principles during quote unquote normal times?
Absolutely, and it's a good question. I would recharacterize it slightly, which is to say, I agree with you. Every crisis is different, right? And an environmental disaster is going to be very different from a workplace violence situation, and the response is going to look very different to those. But I do think having a plan is important. Every organization should have a plan for crisis response. And it should be focused on principles, exactly as you say, right? Not trying to over-dictate what the response is going to be in any individual case, but laying out the process for how the company will respond. And that includes who is part of the crisis management team, making sure there are core representatives to that team, making sure there are alternates or delegates in the event that that core group is not available, having a process in place for how information is escalated, a severity scheme, right? At what point does a regional crisis become a headquarters corporate crisis? At what point do things need to be escalated to the executive team? Having the processes in place about how you do that. What are the communication channels you will use? Will you have a standing Zoom meeting? Will people gather in a particular boardroom? What are the expectations around that? That's important too. And what is the general arc of the decision making that you will use? One framework that organizations employ in this context is the PAIR framework. People, environment, assets, and reputation. And thinking through methodically how a particular situation impacts each of those elements of an organization's response. How do you think about the impact of a crisis on your people, your employees, your customers, the general public, the environment? What are the externalities of this incident on the broader community? The assets of your organization? How does this crisis impact your financial costs because property has been destroyed or things like that? And last but certainly not least, thinking about the reputational consequences of a crisis on the organization and how you should respond there. And so building out some of those frameworks, and I think as you say it exactly right, principles, is what an organization should think about ahead of time.
Hi. I have a two-parter question on executive trust. So obviously with crisis response, there's a lot of sensitive information. My first question is, how do you strike a balance between being transparent while you're leading, but also withholding the information that could be a liability? And the second part is, when a crisis response goes wrong, how do you rebuild that trust as an executive?
Those are hard questions.
Good ones.
Very, very good ones. Starting with what the right balance is of information. I think the first question you should ask yourself is, why am I communicating with this person, right? What do they need to know because it impacts them, because they need to perform a function within the organization? What's the reason to communicate? And that, I think, drives what the substance of the communication should be. And I very much agree with you that it's hard to strike that balance between communicating too much, which can open an organization up to liability, and not sharing enough that puts the audience at a disadvantage in terms of being able to respond effectively. But it's also important, one of the things that comes up far too often in these cases is to say, because you want those people to know and you want to be transparent, to share information that hasn't been vetted, that might change. And so it's important to be mindful of that and to really take a step back and say, if I say this today, what will happen if I have to walk it back tomorrow? And so generally speaking, as I think about crisis response, the organizations often get themselves into trouble when they communicate too much or not following a good process for validating that information rather than the other way around. And as to rebuilding trust, that is the most difficult thing to do, and frankly, why it's so important to make sure that you avoid that situation where you've lost the trust of your employees or your customers, because there is no easy answer to how you rebuild trust. I think rebuilding trust takes a long time. It's not something that is going to happen overnight. It comes from, I think, some of the things we've talked about in terms of a post-mortem from a crisis, to be able to acknowledge things didn't go the way the organization would have wanted or expected, and to provide the right level of detail of what the organization is going to do to fix that, to improve the process. This is a place where outside voices, outside stakeholders can help, where don't just take it from us that we're going to do better next time. We've brought in leading experts to help advise on how we can run this process better, and they have told us, and maybe they will tell you if if they're comfortable doing that, that the processes in this area really have improved. But that is a tough nut to crack in terms of fixing a loss of trust.
This will be our last question, I think, depending on the response, but I think we have time for one more question. Right here.
Well, my question, I'm Jenny Flores with Wells Fargo, was about trust. And so thank you for the insights you provided. I would just add a couple more things since I'm currently dealing with this, not at Wells Fargo, but external. I would say that trust was fundamentally broken, and one of the things I found helpful was to put at the center now of communication somebody who was deeply trusted in the community. Because when no one, like the finger pointing started happening, like trust broke down, no communication was able to cut through. Mm-hmm. And so once we put a person that we all felt like they're neutral, we trust them, like it unlocked the opportunity to now have engagement that was productive. So that was just one thing I recently put into practice that was pretty helpful, but I do agree that building trust in the middle of a crisis is so difficult, because it's also everybody's so super emotional about the situation. So thank you whoever asked the question. It was super helpful to me.
So thank you. We have a little bit of time. There's a question in the back. I see one hand raised. This will be our final question.
Hi everyone, it's Anthony Almanzar with State Street. The one quick question I have is, how would you address communication gaps during a crisis management process?
Communication gaps?
Yes.
It's, one way to do this ahead of time, even before a crisis, is to really map out who are the audiences that an organization needs to communicate with, right? You will need to worry about your customers, the public. The one that's the one that is most frequently forgotten is your own employees. Communicating internally within the organization about what's happening. And so I think it really fixing that gap is really starting with who are the audiences that you're going to need to communicate with. And by the way, beyond the public and the media and your customers and employees, there are a whole bunch of other ones that you need to be thinking about. The board, your external auditors, third parties that you have relationships with, your vendors and suppliers. The list of stakeholders in a crisis is going to be vast oftentimes. And so it's really taking the time ahead of time to think through what are the external touch points that an organization has that it needs to be mindful of, who are going to be asking questions about an organization's response. And I really think that's, the communications team should really be creating that kind of stakeholder map for an organization.
All right, well, thank you. Thank you for wonderful questions, truly, and for a wonderful conversation, Alex. I really appreciate it. So, I know we're standing between everyone and lunch, so please go enjoy, use this opportunity, and reflect. I want everybody to think about what would you do if this were your responsibility in your organizations. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone.
Thank you again to all our speakers from this morning's sessions. We ask that you now join us next door in Golden Gate Ballroom B for our luncheon program featuring Dow Jones's Chief Executive Officer, Almar Latour. See you there.